Nothing needs to be done from here. This message is not here to guide you towards something you haven't already reached. It's not here to teach you what to do next, or to push you into movement, or to convince you that transformation is waiting just beyond the horizon. If you are here, if these words found you in this exact moment, it's because something already completed. Not because you finished a process, not because you achieved enlightenment or mastered yourself, but because the part of you that was endlessly trying, endlessly seeking, endlessly measuring your progress against an invisible standard, that part finally stopped. Movement already stopped being necessary. And if you feel that, if there's a quiet recognition in your chest right now, a sense of relief mixed with something you can't quite name, then this message is simply confirming what you already know. There is a point in the journey where effort stops generating clarity, and clarity stops demanding effort. You may have noticed it already, a strange quietness that settled in without announcement, without celebration, without any grand moment of realization. It's not the kind of peace that comes from solving all your problems or finally figuring everything out. It's something else entirely. It's the absence of the need to figure anything out at all. This video is not here to correct you, to orient you towards some better version of yourself, or to accelerate a process you think should be moving faster. It exists only to confirm something that already stabilized within you, something that doesn't need language, but recognizes itself when it's named. What you might be feeling right now is a kind of neutrality that replaced urgency. Not apathy, not disconnection, not the numbness that comes from shutting down, but a genuine, embodied neutrality. There's a certainty without euphoria, a knowing without the need to prove it, a sense that something fundamental shifted and you no longer feel compelled to explain it, to act on it, or to justify it to anyone, including yourself. You might find yourself pausing more often, not because you're stuck or indecisive, but because the pause itself feels correct. The body doesn't tense when you wait. The mind doesn't spiral when you don't immediately respond. There's less noise, less internal debate, less of that exhausting back and forth between what you should do and what you want to do. This is not indecision. This is conclusion at a systemic level. Your entire being, not just your thoughts, but your nervous system, your energy, the way you interface with reality, has reorganized itself around coherence instead of effort. And if you're wondering whether you're supposed to do something with this information, the answer is already inside you. You don't need to do anything. You never did. There was a time when your life was oriented entirely around fixing, improving, preparing. Every morning began with an assessment of what needed to be corrected, what hadn't yet been addressed, what still required your attention. You moved constantly, not because movement felt good, but because stillness felt dangerous. To stop meant to fall behind. To pause meant to lose ground. So you kept going, kept adjusting, kept trying to organize the chaos into something manageable, something that finally made sense. And beneath all of that movement was a single, relentless argument, an internal debate with reality itself about whether things were okay, whether you were okay, whether any of this would ever be enough. But something happened that you might not have noticed right away. The argument ended, not because you won it, not because you finally proved your point or convinced yourself of anything, but because the need to argue simply dissolved. Your system stopped fighting with what is. It stopped resisting the present moment, stopped negotiating with circumstances, stopped trying to force life into a shape that felt safer or more predictable. The conversation that once consumed so much of your mental and emotional energy just went quiet. And in that quiet, you may have noticed something unsettling at first. A lack of compulsion. The drive to act, to fix, to respond immediately to every thought or feeling. It softened. You found yourself less interested in pushing conversations forward, less concerned with making sure everything was resolved right now, less invested in having an answer for every question that arose. This can feel like something is wrong. It can feel like you've lost your edge, like you're becoming passive or disconnected. But what's actually happening is that your system reorganized itself around coherence instead of effort. The body is no longer spending energy on internal conflict. The mind is no longer running simulations of every possible outcome, trying to prepare for threats that may never arrive. You are not stuck. You are not shutting down. You are not avoiding life. You are simply no longer at war with it. And that shift, as subtle as it is, changes everything. The system didn't malfunction. It recalibrated. It found a frequency where movement is no longer the only proof of aliveness, where stillness is not a problem to be solved, and where the absence of urgency is not a sign that something went wrong. It's a sign that something finally went right. You might have noticed that when you think about taking action right now, something in you hesitates. Not out of fear, not out of doubt, but out of a quiet knowing that pushing forward in this moment would reintroduce noise into a system that just found silence. It's as if your entire being understands something your mind hasn't fully accepted yet, that this phase doesn't respond to force. It never did. Force was the language of the old operating system, the one that believed survival depended on constant intervention, on staying ahead of collapse, on making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. But you're not running that system anymore. You've shifted into something else, something that responds not to effort, but to presence, not to control, but to alignment, not to pressure, but to precision. There's a reason why doing something, anything, feels slightly off right now. It's because action, in this space, has a different quality than it used to. Before, you moved and reality responded. You applied force and things shifted. You pushed and doors opened, or they didn't. But at least you felt like you were participating, like you had some agency in the outcome. Now, the interface has changed. Force no longer translates the way it used to. It doesn't create momentum. It creates friction. It doesn't clarify the path. It clouds it. And your body knows this before your mind does. That's why there's tension when you try to force something forward, and immediate relief when you let it go. The feedback is physical, visceral, faster than thought. Your nervous system is telling you that the old way of engaging with life no longer applies. This is not laziness. This is not avoidance. This is not spiritual bypassing or fear dressed up as surrender. This is your system learning a new language, one where timing matters more than intensity, where clarity matters more than speed, where allowing matters more than controlling. You are being taught by your own body, by your own energy, by the quiet intelligence that runs beneath conscious thought, that not every moment is a moment for action. Some moments are for listening. Some moments are for letting the field reorganize itself without your interference. And this is one of those moments. You haven't lost your ability to act. You've simply gained the ability to discern when action serves and when it disrupts. Force is no longer the correct interface. And if you can trust that, if you can let yourself rest in this knowing, without needing to justify it or explain it or prove it to anyone, you'll begin to notice something remarkable, that clarity arrives on its own, that timing reveals itself naturally, and that when it's time to move, you'll know without having to think about it. There's a distinction that becomes impossible to ignore once you've crossed a certain threshold, and it's the difference between motivation and urgency. Motivation can still exist. You can still want things, still feel drawn towards certain experiences, still have preferences about how your life unfolds. But urgency, that relentless pressure that used to sit in your chest like a stone, that constant sense that time is running out and you're falling behind, and if you don't act now, something critical will be lost. That urgency is gone, and its absence is so complete, so total, that you might wonder if something in you broke. You might look around at the world still moving at its frantic pace, at people still racing against invisible deadlines, still convinced that hesitation equals failure, and you might feel like you've somehow fallen out of sync with reality itself. But what actually collapsed was not your connection to life. What collapsed was the belief that the present moment is insufficient. Urgency only exists when now feels like it's not enough, when this moment seems like a problem that needs solving, when stillness registers as danger and waiting registers as failure. For years, Maybe your entire life, you operated under the assumption that if you weren't constantly moving forward, you were sliding backward, that if you paused, even for a breath, you would lose your place in line, miss your window, fall so far behind that catching up would become impossible. So you ran, you pushed, you forced yourself to stay alert, stay ready, stay one step ahead of whatever collapse was lurking just beyond your peripheral vision. And now, without warning, without any conscious decision on your part, that mechanism shut off. The fear of being late disappeared. The sense that you're supposed to be somewhere other than where you are, doing something other than what you're doing, being someone other than who you are right now. It dissolved. What remains is not apathy. It's not resignation. It's not the exhaustion of someone who gave up. What remains is a kind of spaciousness, a breathing room that you forgot was possible. You can wait now without tension. You can sit in silence without discomfort. You can let a day unfold without needing to fill every gap, answer every question, resolve every uncertainty before the sun goes down. This is what happens when urgency collapses. Time stops feeling like a threat. The present stops feeling like a place you need to escape from. You stop living in constant anticipation of the next thing, the better thing, the thing that will finally make everything make sense. And in that stopping, in that release, something extraordinary becomes available. The ability to be here fully, without the background noise of should and must and not yet, and what if. You're not waiting for permission to relax. You're not waiting for circumstances to improve. You're not waiting for proof that it's safe to stop running. You already stopped, and the world didn't end. The ground didn't disappear beneath your feet. Life didn't punish you for pausing. Instead, it met you exactly where you are, and it whispered something you've been too busy to hear for a very long time. It said, you were never late, you were never behind, you were never insufficient. Urgency only exists when the present feels like it's not enough. When the present is enough, urgency collapses on its own. There was a version of you that worked very hard to be someone. Not just anyone, but someone coherent, someone aligned, someone who could look in the mirror and recognize a narrative that made sense. You constructed that identity carefully, piece by piece, through choices and commitments, and the things you told yourself about who you were and what mattered to you. And for a long time, that construction felt necessary. It felt like the only way to stay intact, to avoid dissolving into chaos, to have some kind of anchor in a world that never stopped shifting beneath your feet. You worked to be conscious, to be awake, to be the kind of person who sees clearly and acts with intention. Even your spirituality became part of that identity. The practices you chose, the books you read, the way you spoke about energy and presence and alignment, all of it fed into a story about who you were becoming. But somewhere along the way, without you noticing exactly when it happened, that effort stopped. The constant maintenance of the self, the need to curate your thoughts and behaviors and energy to match some internal image of what an evolved person looks like. It loosened, not because you stopped caring, not because you gave up on growth or decided that none of it mattered, but because identity itself relaxed its grip. You stopped needing to be someone in particular. You stopped consulting your self-image before making decisions. You stopped checking whether your actions aligned with the story you've been telling about yourself. And in that release, something unexpected emerged, a kind of quiet confidence that doesn't announce itself, doesn't need validation, doesn't require proof. This is not the confidence that comes from achievement or mastery, or finally getting it right. This is the confidence of a system that is no longer contradicting itself. You're not trying to prove coherence anymore. You're not performing alignment for an invisible audience, not even for yourself. You're simply functioning from it. And that changes everything. Decisions no longer need a narrative. They happen, they complete, and they don't leave a residue of doubt or second guessing behind. You don't replay conversations in your mind, analyzing whether you said the right thing, whether you came across the way you intended, whether you maintained your composure or lost your center. The conversation happened. It's over. You move on. There's less comparison now, less measuring yourself against others, less concern about whether you're ahead or behind on some imagined timeline of spiritual progress. You're not scrolling through someone else's life wondering why their path looks smoother, why their breakthroughs seem bigger, why they seem to have figured out something you're still struggling with. Not because you've transcended jealousy or insecurity, but because the frame of reference shifted. You're not running the same race anymore. You're not even on the same track. The part of you that used to look outward for confirmation, for reassurance, for evidence that you were doing this right, that part went quiet. And what's left is a kind of presence that doesn't need external validation, because it's not trying to be anything other than what it is in this moment. You might notice that you care less about how you're perceived, not in a defensive way, not in a nihilistic way, but in a way that feels almost like relief. You're not managing impressions anymore. You're not adjusting your energy to match the room, not performing a version of yourself that you think will be more acceptable, more palatable, more aligned with what others expect from someone on a spiritual path. You show up as you are, and if that doesn't match someone's idea of what conscious looks like, it doesn't disturb you the way it used to. There's no contraction, no defensiveness, no need to explain or justify or convince. You're not proving coherence, you're functioning from it. And the difference between those two states is the difference between effort and flow, between performance and presence, between trying to hold yourself together and discovering that you were never fragmented in the first place. This loosening of identity doesn't mean you lose yourself. It means you stop clutching so tightly to the idea of who you think you're supposed to be. And in that release, you find something far more stable, far more real, far more trustworthy than any story you could construct. You find the part of you that was always here, underneath the layers of effort and image and becoming, waiting for you to stop trying long enough to notice it. There's a quality to action now that didn't exist before, and it's the absence of exhaustion, not the absence of effort, because things still require energy, focus, participation. But the way you engage with them has fundamentally changed. Action used to feel like something you had to manufacture, something you had to talk yourself into, convince yourself was necessary, and then push through with willpower and determination. Every decision carried weight. Every task required momentum. And after you finished, there was always a residue, a mental replay of what happened, a questioning of whether you did it right, a lingering tension that followed you into the next moment like a shadow you couldn't shake. Now, action arises differently. It doesn't need to be fabricated. It doesn't require a buildup of motivation or a mental negotiation about whether this is the right time or the right choice. It simply emerges, naturally, the way breath enters the body without being summoned. And when it completes, it's done. There's no emotional hangover, no need to review it, no compulsion to analyze whether it could have been better or different or more aligned. The thing happened. It served its purpose. You move on. This is not detachment. This is not numbness. This is efficiency at the level of energy, where nothing is wasted on internal friction, on the part of you that used to argue with the part of you that wanted something different. You might notice this most clearly in conversations. There was a time when every exchange felt like it had stakes, when you had to manage the tone, navigate the subtext, make sure you weren't being misunderstood or triggering something in the other person, or saying too much or not enough. Conversations could escalate without warning, spiral into tension, leave you drained even when nothing particularly intense was said. But now, there's a steadiness. Words land where they need to land. Misunderstandings resolve themselves without the usual friction. You say what's true, and it doesn't carry the charge it used to. The other person hears it, or they don't, and either way, you're not pulled into a loop of trying to fix their perception or convince them of something they're not ready to see. Decisions close the moment they're made. This might be one of the most striking shifts. Before, even after you chose something, there was a part of you that kept the door open, kept revisiting whether you made the right call, kept running alternate scenarios in the background like a program you couldn't shut down. But now, When you decide, it's final. Not in a rigid way, not in a way that refuses to adapt if new information emerges, but in a way that trusts the choice was correct for that moment with the information and clarity you had. There's no second guessing, no mental loop, no wondering if you should have waited longer, thought harder, consulted more people, gathered more data. The decision happened. The path is set. You walk it without looking back. This is what it feels like when the internal system is no longer fighting itself. When the part of you that wants one thing is no longer at war with the part of you that fears the consequences of wanting it. When your actions are no longer compromises between conflicting desires, but expressions of a coherence that runs deeper than thought. You're not navigating your life from the surface anymore, trying to manage outcomes, trying to control how things unfold. You're moving from a place that already knows, that already trusts, that doesn't need proof before it acts, because it's not acting from belief, it's acting from alignment. And alignment doesn't require faith. It doesn't require certainty. It only requires the absence of internal contradiction. Confianza here is not belief. It's the absence of the war you used to wage with yourself every single day. And when that war ends, action becomes effortless, not because nothing is required of you, but because you're no longer spending half your energy resisting the very thing you're trying to do. Something shifts in the environment when you stop fighting with yourself. And it's not something you can force or fabricate or even fully explain. It's simply something you begin to notice. The external world, the circumstances you move through, the people you encounter, the way situations resolve themselves, all of it starts to feel less resistant. Not easier in the way you might have imagined ease would look. Not free of challenge or complexity or difficulty, but less stuck, less repetitive, less like you're being forced to learn the same lesson over and over again in increasingly dramatic ways until you finally get it right. The loops that used to dominate your experience, the patterns that played out with such predictable regularity that you could almost script them before they happened, they begin to dissolve. There was a time when life felt like it was shouting at you, when every setback was a message, every obstacle was a test, every disappointment was evidence that you weren't aligned enough, weren't doing the inner work correctly, weren't raising your vibration high enough to access the reality you were trying to create. And so, you worked harder, you tried to fix yourself faster. You pushed yourself to clear more blocks, release more trauma, transmute more shadow, convinced that if you could just get yourself right, the external world would finally stop resisting you. But the paradox you're discovering now is that the less you try to control, the more precisely reality responds. Not because you mastered some technique or finally cracked the code, but because your system is no longer broadcasting conflict. When you were at war with yourself, when part of you wanted one thing and another part feared it, when your conscious intentions contradicted your subconscious beliefs, the field around you reflected that contradiction. It had to. Reality doesn't respond to what you say you want, it responds to what you are. And when what you are is fragmented, when your energy is split between desire and resistance, between hope and fear, between moving forward and bracing for collapse, the external world mirrors that fragmentation back to you. It shows you the conflict, it gives you the lesson, it creates the friction necessary to get your attention, to force you to look at what's unresolved, to make the internal war so loud that you can't ignore it anymore. But now, the system quieted, the war ended. And because your internal state is no longer contradictory, reality doesn't need to shout anymore. The corrections that come, and they still come because growth is not a destination, but a continuum, arrive softly, subtly, a quiet insight instead of a crisis, a gentle redirection instead of a collapse, a whisper instead of a scream. Life speaks low now because you're finally listening. You're not so consumed by your own noise, so distracted by the endless internal debate, that you miss the quiet signals. You hear them, you feel them, you respond before the volume needs to increase. This doesn't mean everything becomes perfect. It doesn't mean challenges disappear or that you're suddenly immune to difficulty or pain. But the texture of those challenges changes. They feel less punitive, less like punishment for something you failed to understand, less like evidence that you're broken or cursed or fundamentally misaligned with the universe. They feel more like invitations, more like refinements, more like the natural friction of a system that's evolving, adjusting, recalibrating in real time. And you meet them differently. You don't collapse into victimhood. You don't spiral into self-blame. You don't spend days or weeks dissecting what you did wrong, what you should have seen coming, what cosmic law you violated to deserve this outcome. You simply see what is, respond to what's needed, and move forward without the story that used to keep you trapped in cycles of shame and self-correction. The environment is not separate from you. It never was. It's an extension of your internal state, a reflection of the coherence or conflict running beneath your conscious awareness. And when that internal state stabilizes, when the contradiction dissolves, when you stop being at war with yourself, reality stops being at war with you. It doesn't mean life bends to your will. It means life stops needing to break you open to get your attention. The resistance falls away not because you conquered it, but because there's nothing left to resist. You're no longer pushing against yourself, so the world no longer needs to push back. This is not a call to action. There is no next step waiting for you at the end of this message. No technique to apply, no practice to begin, no method to master. If you came here looking for instructions on what to do now, on how to leverage this state into something bigger or better or more productive, you may feel disappointed. But that disappointment itself is just the final echo of the old system, the one that believed transformation required effort, that peace required maintenance, that alignment was something you had to work to sustain. That system is no longer running. And if you're honest with yourself, you already know that. You knew it before you clicked on this video. You knew it in the quiet moments when you stopped trying and nothing collapsed. You knew it when urgency dissolved and life didn't punish you for pausing. You knew it when action became effortless and decisions stopped haunting you and the war with yourself finally ended. This message exists only to confirm what already happened. Nothing was lost. Nothing was delayed. Nothing went wrong. The absence of urgency is not a warning sign. It's not evidence that you've become passive or disconnected or spiritually complacent. It's a signal. It's the body's way of telling you that the process already completed, that the reorganization already occurred, that you've crossed a threshold you didn't even know you were approaching. You're not waiting for something to begin. You're recognizing something that already finished. And if there's a sense of relief in hearing that, if something in your chest softens or your breath deepens or a quiet knowing rises up and says, yes, that's it, then you don't need this video to tell you what comes next. You already know. You've always known. The paradox is that nothing needs to be done from here because nothing is missing. Not because you've arrived at some final destination, not because the journey is over and there's nowhere left to go, but because the part of you that was constantly measuring the distance between where you are and where you should be, that part went silent. And in its absence, you discover that you were never actually far from anything. You were never behind. You were never insufficient. You were never broken in a way that required fixing. The gap you spent so much energy trying to close was never real. It was a story, a belief, a frequency your system was running that made separation feel true. But separation was never true. And now that the system stopped broadcasting it, you can feel that. You can rest in it. You can let it hold you without needing to understand it or explain it, or turn it into something you can teach or share or prove to anyone else. If this resonated, you don't need to do anything with it. You can stay here. You can let these words settle. You can close your eyes and feel the truth of what was said. Or you can walk away and never think about it again. Either way, coherence holds. It doesn't need your participation to remain intact. It doesn't need your effort to sustain itself. It simply is. And so are you. Nothing needs to be done from here because nothing is missing. You already know this. You've always known this. And now, finally, the knowing is louder than the doubt.